afflictions and persecutions. They come against you trying to get your attention off of God and off of His Word. And if you get to where you start focusing on your problems, as you magnify your problems, then your value, your worth, your magnification of God decreases. And this is what happens. And this is the first step in losing what God has done in your life. And this is what I've been teaching all week from Romans 1:21. It says, because that when they knew God, they glorified Him not as God. That's what I've been focusing on. To glorify God means to value, to prize, to magnify God. Neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Those are the first four things that happens when a person begins to start losing the joy, the peace, the love, the benefit of what God has done in their life. And then the rest of Romans chapter 1 just goes on and talks about progressive steps, how that you get into your own wisdom instead of God's wisdom. How it describes homosexuality right here as being one of the last steps away from God before a person becomes reprobate. You know, I've actually had some people say, well, homosexuality isn't even mentioned in the Bible. Well, the word homosexual wasn't even in use until, I think, the early 1900s. It's a relatively new term. So the word homosexual isn't here, but man, homosexuality is spoken about many different times. It's an abomination to God. And Romans chapter 1 talks about men burning in their passion towards men and leaving the natural use of the woman, and it talks about women doing the same thing. It's talking about homosexuality, and it is one of the last steps in hardening your heart against God before you become reprobate. The word reprobate is describing where you just no longer have any knowledge of God, no conviction of God, because you did not like. Here's the way it says it in verse 28, and even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a reprobate mind to do those things which are not convenient. A reprobate mind is just talking about a mind that is void of any consciousness of God. God is not speaking to you. God is not drawing you. Jesus said, you can't approach God unless God is drawing you to Himself. So when you become reprobate and God just leaves you to yourself and He no longer is drawing you, then that means that there is no hope of salvation. You won't come to God on your own without the influence of the Holy Spirit upon your life. So this is a terrible state, and it all begins with not placing the proper value on God. You aren't glorifying God the way you should. And as I've said during this week, this is basically every person that you see that succeeds in the Bible, they did exactly what I've been talking about this week. They glorified God. They esteemed the reproaches of Christ to be greater riches than the treasures in Egypt. That's what it said about Moses in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 26. This is what Jesus did when He entered the cross. He despised the shame. That word despise means to disesteem, the exact opposite of what we were talking about. Instead of glorifying the problems and the suffering, if He would have done that, well then His glory and His worth and magnification of God would have decreased. But no, He disesteemed the cross. He despised the shame, and He glorified the end results of what His death and resurrection would produce. He looked at us and thought we were worth all of the suffering. So this same principle, it operates in Jesus, it operated in Moses. When the children of Israel went to spy out the promised land, this is recorded in Numbers chapter 13. They came back and they gave a good report about the land. They said it's a beautiful land. And they actually had one cluster of grapes that was so huge that they had to put it on a pole and carry it between two men. Now, we don't even relate to that. Things aren't like that today. I believe in evolution, but not evolution from slime to where we became this complex person and stuff without God. I believe that God created everything perfect, and because of sin, everything has been evolving down. At one time, the land of Israel was so abundant that their grapes, they must have been like apples, and a cluster of grapes was just huge. It's not that way today, but it was a beautiful land, and they brought back samples of all of this, and they talked about how abundant the land was. But look at the negative report that these men brought